To talk to you. I've just come from a meeting with Christopher Pyne, who is the new Minister for Science, and he's filled me with enthusiasm. But he really has. He and I go back a long way. I think he reminded me that the first time we ever met, we were having a fight about something. That's probably true. I was probably a Vice-Chancellor at the time, and he was probably a brand new, eager and energetic Member of Parliament, aged about 26 or 7. And he did remind me that when Prime Minister Abbott extended my term in this job, which nobody had ever expected would happen, but they did for about a year. He said to me this morning, yes, and I did persuade him that you weren't a bad bloke for an old lefty. And I said, and I showed him that I was wearing an appropriate lining on my jacket and that I would never wear a blue tie. He was. But it is interesting times for us in the science community generally, because I think we're seeing a radically different rhetorical commitment. I mean, you're seeing the public statements, so have I. Just saying to Miles earlier that we've been back and looked at all of Malcolm Turnbull's speeches for the last 5 years to see the thread that runs through them and pick out the key words. And there are key words in there that I've also used, like how Australia does need to be more agile than we've been. That we do need to think about how we actually fill the troughs between the peaks of resources boom, and we can't just wait for the next one to happen along, presuming that there will be another one happening along. He's talked in those terms. He's talked in terms of opportunity that comes from the challenge, which is completely true. He and I both quite independently have used expressions like priming Australia for the future rather than trying to future-proof Australia. Because, as I said in a speech the other day, we built a rabbit-proof fence to keep the rabbits out. We put starling shooters on the West Australian, South Australian border to keep the starlings out of Western Australia and to keep it starling-proof. We do all of these things, and build bomb-proof shelters and things. So I mean, it's a different way of looking at it. I think he's right to think about how we will prime Australia for a future. That whatever else we can anticipate, and we probably can't do that in fine detail, but we can predict that it will be different. So the question is, how do we shape today, and how do we begin the investment today for that future? And as I reminded Minister Pyne just now, that the school students starting school this year won't enter our workforce till 2030. The ones who are making subject choices at the end of Year 10 this year won't get into the workforce till around 2020. So, and all of that sits alongside reports that say 75% of the jobs that we now do in Australia won't exist by 2020. Now, I know about those projections. I know that those projections were probably made by economists. So you can imagine the weight that I put in those projections, but it nevertheless points a direction. And I think that what we have to be willing to do, and much more willing to do than we have in the past, is to look at what the signposts are telling us and begin to prepare ourselves to be agile, to be able to take advantage of the opportunities and so on as they emerge. And so one of the good things about the meeting with Minister Pyne this morning was that I do believe that he's filled with enthusiasm for the task at hand, that we are actually seeing a shift, early green shoots as we call them, but an early shift in some of the commitments that really do need to be made in an area like science, where, as I will say later, it's actually a pipeline, it's not a tap. You can't just reach across and turn it on or turn it off or slow it down because you feel like it at the moment. But you have a problem to deal with and you go and turn on the tap and out comes a solution from the scientists. It is actually about how you develop the capacity without limiting the capacity to the present, but offering people the opportunities to roam the landscape with discipline, with quantitative skills, with creative skills, analytical skills, all of those sorts of things. But you give them the opportunity to be able to move and to apply their skills and talents where the circumstances demand it. Now, I've been in this job for nearly 4.5 years. I finish at the end of this year. And I guess that one of the striking things that I've concluded, and these are just basically personal conclusions, they're not necessarily shared by anybody else, although I've shared them with a lot of people. I'm surprised at the extent to which Australia has become risk averse in a lot of these areas. We don't actually challenge ourselves now. We deliver ourselves little homilies like we punch above our weight. But when you ask what that means, it means that we're actually not better than the countries that we could be like, and we are better than the countries that are a long way behind us. And yet we use it as a sort of security blanket. Oh yeah, that's good. We're good at that. Punch above our weight, above world standard. Don't you think that world standard is actually too low a bar for a country like this to set for itself, that we should be thinking about how do we look like, get like, do what the best could do, whatever the measures are that you're trying to apply, all of which are flawed. But all of them help you make a judgment, and they show you which way the signpost is heading. It says Melbourne, 647 kilometres away. It doesn't say 647.12534 kilometres away. And we need to know that broad direction, and we need to be able to identify it and articulate it. Because one of the other things that surprised me when I got into this game, and you see the world, as a Vice-Chancellor, you see part of this world, but you see it through a different prism. So it looks quite different. So you get into it from this side and you say to yourself, well, why is it that we've got 150 programs supporting science R&D in Australia? I mean, we're a little country in many respects. We're good in many respects, and we're good at many of the things that we do. But we're not good at everything. But one of the things that we're exceptionally good at is spreading an amount of money very thinly. And so we've got 150 odd programs across 14 federal portfolios with little coordination and little structure behind it to enable that coordination, to say that this crew have got hold of the innovation policy, but there's no point having an innovation policy if your education system is not producing people who are willing to populate the innovation policy, or that the innovation policy and directions is not actually saying we need more mathematicians or physicists or chemists or philosophers or whatever it is. We've actually got to begin to think a bit differently about how we plan and be strategic about our approach to these things. Our resources rationed. It will always be rationed. There has never been enough money to fund the research that we could do in any country for that matter, but certainly not in this country. I remember when I was a young academic lamenting the fact that, you'd put in for a grant, you put in an application, you put in a carefully constructed budget that was only 50% more than you actually needed, and they'd give you only 50% of what you asked for. So you'd always be up against this notion that this is what it would take to do the research I want to do. It's deemed to be fundable, but the money was spread. And it was always, I used to sit on NH and MRC selection, grant project selection committees, and we used to spend, and in those days we interviewed everybody, and you did it out of 6. And so somebody'd come in, they'd get interviewed, they'd walk out, you'd vote, and they got 5.2 average. You say, but hang on a second, last year 5.2 didn't get me money. That was a really good project. Should we make it 5.3? Whatever. There's always this second guessing going on because we've never had enough money. It's always been a rationed resource. But we've also been unwilling to say that for a proportion of that resource, that there are things that we have to make sure that we're doing, and not just things that people feel like doing. So the approach that I've been taking is to say, for a proportion of the resource, we have to just make sure that we are willing to say that there are some things that are critically important for Australia to be doing for a couple of reasons. One is we need it. So who else would do research on the Murray-Darling Basin for us? Who else would do research on the Great Artesian Basin, which is sitting above vast shale gas reserves? Get any fugitive gases out of that, and you've had a significant impact on a lot of Australian agriculture, a lot of Australian way of life, really, because a lot of the rural towns and parts of the country depend on it for water supply and so on. So who would do that for us? Nobody would do it for us. We've got to do those things ourselves, and it's got to be good. It's got to be good in a way that enables our capacity to integrate into the global capacity, because we will learn from them. We produce 3% of the world's output approximately in research. And for as long as I can remember, we've been saying, and we do that from only 0.3% of the world's population. So we punch above our weight. Well, I think that is actually like putting Mogadon in the drinking water, because it hides the questions we should be asking ourselves. What does it actually mean? How good are we? Not just in absolute numbers and put it out there and it gets published. And of course, government policies over decades now have actually encouraged people to publish anything. So, in amongst which there are some really good bits. So let me make it clear that our best are the equal of the best in the world, and I have no hesitation in saying it. But you know, the journal Nature last year published a paper which said that since 1900 there'd been 58 million articles published, mostly science articles published, 58 million. And of those, approximately 28 million had never been cited more than once. If you think about that in the Australian context, from a university, your university would get the same number of dollars reward for a paper of one of the 28 million to one in the top 100. So there's no incentive to stretch and strain that bit harder. We continue to ration the resource and spread it quite thinly. We set world standard as a benchmark, and we sent a ratio of 3% from 0.3, which is actually around about 8th or 9th when you look at the countries we could be like. It's behind Switzerland, it's behind Sweden, it's behind Denmark, it's behind the UK, it's actually ahead of the US. And they're so dominant that the sort of sheer volume and quality overwhelms you. It's ahead of China, but China is growing output at an exponential rate because it's output that is actually being counted rather than necessarily quality of output. And we've fallen into some of those traps and use ratios that are signposts, but the signposts sometimes provoke you to ask an important question. And one of the important questions we should be asking ourselves relentlessly and seeking to answer in using maximum possible amount of information you can get, because I can't think of any one that isn't flawed, but put together, they give you the message. How good are we? Are we investing where we need to invest? And when you come up with a conclusion that says we are investing where we need to invest, but we're not investing enough, then you've got a case for more money. So I haven't been particularly persuaded by my former colleagues. I wasn't persuaded by many of them when I was one of their colleagues, but now that I'm one of their former colleagues, I'm not particularly persuaded that you can just go to a government and say, give us 3% of GDP. So the first question a sensible politician will ask you is, what will you do with that? The answer has got to be, because it hasn't been thought through, we'd spend it. Why? Oh, well, because we haven't got enough. So what do you want, 3% of GDP? Why? Because we haven't got enough. What would you do with it? Spend it. I mean, we've got to take a different approach in Australia. And it's critically important now because so much of the rest of the world is shifting. So when I started out in this job, as I said, I was looking through all this and looking at what other countries were doing. And when you look at most of the countries, say Western European countries, US, Canada and so on, then they have, and the EU as a whole, they have significantly strategic approaches to the way they invest in their science and research, and they see it as a whole of pipeline. They don't see research as something that sits over there and education as something that's over there, and you just got to hope the two lead you in the same direction. Or innovation policy, sits over there somewhere, and you just presume that you will get what you need from the research and the education sector. So I was particularly taken by the Americans. I think the Americans, the land of the free, extraordinarily driven. They have had research priorities for 40 years. My counterpart in the US can take you through their budget papers over 40 years and show you how their priorities have influenced the overall budget spend. So they don't get down to, what Eric Weigold does in Eric Weigold's lab. They get down to the fact that we ought to be doing stuff on cyber security, and there ought to be cross-agency connectedness with that, because it sits across boundaries. It's not all inside one agency. So they spend a fair bit of their resource on that. The British have had research priorities for a decade or so. The striking characteristic, and so do the other countries. When I started this, we were the only country without a strategy, only country without an overarching science policy for directing our future or influencing our future. And so, they've struck the balance between over-directing and stifling creativity, and still saying, but there are some things we have to make sure we're doing, and doing them well, and funding them well enough to be able to do them well. So we have proposed such a process here, and that was basically the essence of my discussion with Minister Pine this morning, because there's been a change. The issue is we've got the other ones up to the glass of water. Have we now got them willing to pick it up and sip at it to make sure that we're actually identifying what we can do, what we do need to do, and how we build the capability and the capacity. Now, part of that capacity building, as far as I'm concerned, was we articulated in a paper that I put out last September. And we said that for a comprehensive whole-of-government science strategy, or STEM, science, technology, engineering and mathematics strategy, we needed 4 key elements in it, now 5, but so let me say 5, but 5 key elements in it. One is innovation. When you look at what the rest of the world does, governments play a role in driving innovation in the right way. They don't get in the way. They facilitate, they enhance, they enhance through building capability, through appropriate regulation, all of those sorts of things. Whereas we've tended not to do that, so we've got multiple programs, and they're small. So we don't build scale, we have to build scale. And you look at, I don't know how many of you know which is the biggest venture capital funder in the world as we sit here today. So I'll tell you, it's the US government. The US government does it through 2 or 3 very sizable, scaled-up programs, one of which started 25 years ago under Ronald Reagan, which they now just have reviewed again and are increasing its contribution. And they claim that they've got on average 7 patents a day by linking their research capacity to small to medium enterprises. When we proposed that here, we were told by an economist, I think it was, wouldn't work in Australia. So we're different. We're so different that something that's so sensible and it's worked so well that the British copied it. To show that it's different, they call it SBRI rather than SBAR. But it's very similar. Countries in our region have got similar things, in Scandinavia similar things. So they've all done it. But we say, it wouldn't work in Australia. So we're fighting against that one. Because the message is, the signpost is, that activity in these areas is driven. It is not presumed that you can have a Prime Minister or a Minister or whatever. So we believe in innovation. And that's all they've got to do, and the rest of us will go out and innovate. Nowhere else is it presumed that will be the outcome. Everywhere else says, what are the right programs on the right scale and the right way, not gross deregulation and stifling of creativity and so on, but which are the ways we can do that and draw benefit from the capacity and the capability we have. And we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to do that as a country because that's what the rest of the world is doing. I was disappointed to hear when Joe Hockey was still Treasurer, but about a month or so ago when he was announcing the latest GDP figures, and one of the reporters said to him, so what's still growing? Because it was at 2.something%. What's still growing? And he said, still selling iron ore international education and tourism. And I thought to myself, I would hope that in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time, we could give a treasurer something more to say than international education and tourism, and a bunch of people would go around and say to me, but Ian, you don't understand, we're just a service economy. Is that the future? Well, I hope not. So we put innovation in there up front, we put education in there, because at the end of the day, why are we happily sitting around saying, or lamenting, hand-wringing, and saying that our number of students studying science in Year 12 is at their lowest level in 25 years? And so Christopher Pyne, when he was then Minister for that, he announced that there would be, with his colleagues, a national STEM strategy for schools. I think that was important. He also said maybe we should make some of it compulsory. So you can imagine what happened. A whole bunch of people came out and blasted him for saying some of it. They could consider in so doing that some could be made compulsory. So he got attacked for that, not supported for saying, yeah, let's have a national STEM strategy for schools and try to change the way we do it. People say to me, but Ian, you can't make it compulsory, and I probably agree with it. And they're not enrolling in these subjects because they've got a lot of choices. The question is, why aren't they choosing physics, chemistry, mathematics? And I'll tell you the answer to that if you ask me the question. But it really shows that we're not willing to see what other countries are doing. So in America, Obama puts $100 million on the stump to produce more science teachers for schools, because their objective is to produce 1 million more engineer and science graduates from their universities by 2020, from now, or from 2010. So that's a 50% increase. Now, the university is saying this will be hard. You can't tell us what to do. But Obama knows that there are people like me that populate universities. Show a bucket of cash, and you do anything. So what you have to do, voluntary coercion, I call it, you just say, will you volunteer to do this for us? Here's a bit of money. You're welcome. If I do more, will I get more? And that's really, we've got to sort of find a way to get through. The Americans do it. The British enrolment in British mathematics was going down like this in Year 12, senior, secondary, was going down like this. So they got worried about it. So they made some changes. They appointed a person as a sort of national mathematics strategist or something. The Vice-Chancellors all told her that it would never work. And now the enrolments have gone up like this, back to near to where they used to be. Now they have to say, well, we didn't think it would, but it did. But they did something about it. They didn't actually just sit there and wait. They said, we're going to change this. And so they did. We need to learn from that. We put research in there, of course, because there's a danger in all of this that research will become something that we think of as only an applied activity, that you draw off the capital of knowledge, stock of knowledge that you've got right now, and you use it. And it is inconceivable that we would let ourselves get into that position. We have to be able to say, sure, that's important. It is important for innovation. But what's actually important is the knowledge and the ideas that can flow from the knowledge. So in 1996, 25 leaders of American corporations wrote an open letter to the President reminding the President, Clinton, that it was the federal government's responsibility to fund the patient capital, which created an environment for inspired risk-taking, which was their environment. And they brought the two together very nicely. In 2001, John Howard was going to put a lot of money into science. And I thought it would be good if we got Australian corporate leaders to put out a letter like that, because he already committed, it wasn't political. And I got a guy I knew who was the CEO of a big company and asked him if he'd get onto some of his colleagues. In the end, he was the only one who was prepared to sign it. So we couldn't actually get him to stand up and say, yes, Prime Minister, that's what you should be doing. And you do that, it creates an environment which we can make use of, as well as knowledge. And if you go back to what I said before, we're 3% from 100%, which leaves 97% done elsewhere. So we have to have the capacity here to integrate into that and to be able to use it for our interests, to contribute to it. Before the Second World War, Australia was, in intellectual research terms, was essentially a mendicant nation. It wasn't a requirement that universities do research. CSIRO, of course, did some. but it was very thin on the ground in Australia. It was only after 1946 and the post-war reconstruction that they decided that they would never let that happen again. So they started off with ANU, and so we shifted in 1946. One university expected to do research. To these days, all universities are expected to do research. It's a dramatic shift. But the real thing was that we realised at the time, if you look at the history books, that we were actually being given the knowledge and information that we wanted, that what they would give us, not necessarily what we wanted. And so that was never going to happen again. And I think that we've got to defend seriously that position, because we can't let it drift back there and presume that all we have to do is take something somebody does in San Diego, bring it into Australia, and be, what some in the world, I forget the discipline, but some in the world say, oh, we're fast followers. Well, fast follower means you can only be no better than second. Why would we condemn ourselves to that? So what are we good at? Where do we have comparative advantage? Where do we have special skills and capability? Where can we bring it all together to make a big difference and contribute to the world stock of knowledge? That's what we have to ask ourselves and make sure that we fund it and that we do it well. And then we talked about international engagement. And this for me is critically important because, as I said, 97% is done there, 3% is done here. Our best are the equal of the best anywhere in the world by any measure that we can apply. So we've got a big contribution that we can make. But our international engagement has tended to be sporadic. So, for example, we had a very small fund run by the academies to engage with researchers in other countries. That just got cut. There is a view abroad that it must be a frolic, because why would you go somewhere like the University of Bordeaux in Vintage if it wasn't a frolic? So there's a cynical criticism of the scientists' need to engage with people in other countries, especially if the partner lives in another part of the world. And it got cut. Now, so I was disappointed that it got cut. So we're trying now to rebuild it, to get it back in. But in order to do that, the argument is that we have to be much more strategic. So we have an Australia-India fund, and I forget how much it is, 9 million, I think. It's fairly small anyway. And when I was being told about it, I was told that it supported 400 programs. And I thought to myself how much happier I would have been to have heard that it supported 4 or 40, where they got a problem with potable water, we got a problem with potable water. Let's work together and bring our experts together and support them, as long as the quality is there, but support them to do that. We got a transport problem, urban sprawl, whatever. So have we. There are issues that we share with many countries around the world, but we could actually be much more strategic in how we use what is, after all, a relatively small amount of money. So we wrote some research priorities. We did had some serious discussions with the Commissioner for Research in the European Union, because they were doing theirs at the same time. And of course, the big challenges that they face are just like the big challenges that we face. And then we have superimposed some particularities in Australia, and so do they. So we got together and we produced those, and they're beginning to get some traction now. But the main thread in the argument is we have to be integrated into the world of science. It is close to inconceivable that we could isolate ourselves, except in some unbelievably idiosyncratic and relatively small areas. But we have to be integrated into the world of science to draw benefit from all the work that's being done elsewhere. And the only way we will draw maximum benefit, in my view, is if we are also contributors. The idea that we could wait outside the tent and saying we need to know what happens to crown of thorns starfish, to take a case that Penny and I now worry about. But if you wait for the rest of the world to do it, you could be waiting for a long time. So we've actually got to be able to make our contributions, and we've got to be able to draw benefits from that, and do things that are in our national interest by drawing benefits from that. So this is not about altruism and sort of tossing stuff onto the table for anybody to pick up. There's a bit of that, but it's also a bit about making sure that we can draw some benefit from it. So we have made the argument in one of my papers that we need a serious and strategic approach to international linkages. We start off in a good place, I think, because because we started relatively late in the research game, effectively, let's say, after 1946. When, for those of you who don't know, a chunk of ANU's early budget was spent sending people overseas to get PhDs, because we did not produce our first homegrown PhD until 1948. So when ANU was established with the research schools, we had to send people off to get the research degree to come back and populate the research schools. And so we got into it relatively late. But it's also meant we've been internationally connected from those very early days. And so I think that's benefited us. I mean, I'm reminded that we had scientific linkages in astrophysics with China in the 1960s. And Chinese astrophysicists were coming out to Australia, and we were sending Australians to China to build radio telescopes in China, 10 years or so before we had diplomatic relations. Now, I wouldn't argue that one was the second was a direct consequence of the first, but I don't reckon it hurt that serious senior Chinese scientists were being able to be sent to Australia in the 1960s, and for Australian scientists to go there. So when it percolated up and said, why don't we have diplomatic relations with this country, somebody somewhere said, oh yeah, they behave well, or did whatever. And I think that sort of use of science as a form of soft diplomacy and our capacity to contribute as well as to draw from is, I think, an important part of what we do, but it's not been particularly coherently organised. So we've recommended that if you look at the map of the world and you see US and Canada over here together, but even the US on its own, it's a big, huge research block. We've been looking at the number of cited research papers in the top 1% in the world recently for another purpose. And of the 2,300 or something, the United States produces 1,750. So it's this big, huge block, a lot of high-quality stuff sitting there. You've got the European Union and its research block sitting over there, and you've got us connecting to both, because we do, and we have a lot of connections with both at the individual level, and also to our north. But so we propose that we should actually set up a Asian Area Research Zone so that we can work with colleagues in our vicinity. We can share infrastructure, we can facilitate exchange of people, we can share students in a different way, and that we should do it strategically, because at the end of the day, we're not going to have a truckload of money to throw at this issue. We're going to have to say, in that area, that area, that area. And people who populate a particular discipline, academic discipline, would say that's picking winners. I say, yeah, that'd be good. Let's pick a few. And when you do, you're going to lose a few. And learning from what other countries do, when the British minister was out here, a man famed for his intellect, we were talking about this, and I said to him, oh, what is picking winners? Oh, I said, yeah, we're way past that. Everybody knows we've got to pick areas because we don't have enough money to go around, and everybody now knows that not all of them will work. So we've got to get ourselves into that too and be strategic and think about how we do it. And I would like to share infrastructure a lot better than we do in our neighbourhood, and get together and form a real partnership rather than something where we're saying to people, we'll do this and it's our way or the highway, but to get together to actually build capacity, capability, and in capacity I include infrastructure and people, and to do it together in ways that we haven't really done before, although we haven't been bad at it, but it's been driven by the interests of individuals where there are some bigger strategic issues that we need to address. So between one thing and another, I think the important message for us is to, in science in Australia, is to always have an eye on the strategic, the advantage, the opportunity that comes from the challenges and the changes that will occur, to think about how we learn from other countries, and to integrate well into the activities of those other countries through strategically designated programs where they have an interest, we have an interest, and the benefit will be so much greater if we work together. I think it's beginning to have traction. I think it's beginning to work, and I think what we now have to do is to make sure that each time a government changes, because as you know, the average life of an Australian Parliament is 2.7 years, and as I said to them the other day, that my first ever research grant from the NHMRC was 3 years. So I outlasted a Parliament, or somewhere during that project grant I probably had 2, and maybe a change of government. Back in the 1980s we didn't change government, do we, very often, but anyway, there were changes. So you certainly got changes of ministers, changes of direction, changes of influence, changes of... So we've got to get ideally we'd have a bipartisan, consistent, strategic, clearly articulated purpose for it all, so we all know why we're doing what we're doing. Thank you.